Everything is one. My dreaming tells me.
Hi everyone, I'm Jess Moore, CEO of Social Enterprise Australia. It's a privilege to welcome you to today's event, the first of the Social Enterprise Development Initiative Open Learning Communities. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands we all join from today and recognise their continuing connection to lands, waters and culture. I'm here on beautiful Dharawal country. I pay respects to the living knowledges of elders past, present and emerging, and pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. I'm grateful to my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues and friends who are helping me and many others in this field to grow ways of seeing, doing and being that contribute towards a healing future for all of us. I'm thankful for their patience and grace as we slowly unlearn colonial ways of being and build muscles of collective collaborative care. This requires us to understand the past and the role we play in building a shared, just and reconciled future. This is not easy or comfortable. It is the systems change work that we must do. Today's event forms part of the Australian Government's Social Enterprise Development Initiative, an initiative to strengthen social enterprise capability and to help build capability for all actors in the social enterprise field to grow social impact. As part of this, Social Enterprise Australia is the SETI Education and Mentoring Coordinator. In this role, we are bringing together leading practice materials and learning communities in a digital commons called Understory. It's a digital commons by which we mean it's shaped by all who choose to take part. A key part of Understory is 4 types of learning communities: open learning, like this one, smaller peer learning and support communities, deep experience communities, and innovation collaborations. Learning communities have been developed to create space for diverse perspectives, voices, and leadership, and to contribute to making the sector more welcoming, reflective, and diverse. We really value diverse opinions and today encourage open dialogue, including where perspectives, positions, and views of conveners and contributors might differ from Social Enterprise Australia, the Australian Government, who are funding this work, and others here today. This is the first of the Social Enterprise Development Initiative Open Learning events and is an opportunity to share learnings, insights, and innovations from across the sector. We are so thrilled to have Shifting Ground convening it. Before I introduce the facilitators, I want to thank and hand over to the Honourable Andrew Leigh, Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities, Treasury and Employment, and Federal Member for FENA in the ACT.
G'day, my name's Andrew Leigh, the Assistant Minister for Charities. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal land. Daranuna, Daranunawal, Yungu, Nalamanyan, Dunimanyan, Nanawawari, Darawari, Dindi, Wangaralin, Jinyin. I acknowledge all First Nations people present and thank Social Enterprise for the vital work that you do in closing the gaps. It's a real pleasure to be asked by the remarkable Jess Moore of Social Enterprise Australia to say a few words at the beginning of this Learning Communities event. It is appropriate that your first Learning Communities event focuses on First Nations. The concept of discussing First Nations principles for social enterprise is a vital one for Australia. We recognise that so much of what we do needs to include First Nations perspectives. Social enterprises are through our communities and are building a stronger, more connected society. They are doing a power of good for reaching out to the most disadvantaged. Social enterprises are lifting up people with disabilities, assisting those who've just come out of jail. They're there for people who are struggling with addiction challenges, and they're available for people who've just arrived in Australia. Social enterprises are like the social glue in our society, bringing us together, assisting the most vulnerable, and ultimately empowering the community. The Albanese government is committed to seeing our social enterprises thrive, and conversations like these are critical to strengthening our existing social enterprises and to building new ones. I know that through your conversations you'll share wisdom and insights, that established organisations will provide ideas to new ones, all brokered by your terrific facilitators, Shifting Grounds, Lily Brown and Genevieve Greaves. Thank you for all that each of you do as members of Australia's great social enterprise community. Thank you again to Social Enterprise Australia, and I wish you all the best for a productive conversation today.
I'd like to say an enormous thanks to Andrew for sending this message to us today and for his ongoing advocacy and support for social enterprise. It's an absolute privilege to be in the presence of our hosts and guest speakers for today's session. Our hosts today are Dr. Lily Brown and Genevieve Greaves. Dr. Lily Brown is an educator, facilitator, and researcher who has worked across the not-for-profit, government, corporate, arts, and culture and education sectors on racial literacy and cultural safety. With a master's degree in education from the University of Cambridge and a doctorate in youth studies from the University of Melbourne, Lily's work is informed by her relationships and work with communities and young people across Australia. She belongs to the Gumbaynggirr people of the mid-north coast of New South Wales and lives on the lands of the Yawuru and Jugun people in Rubibi, Broome. Lily is the CEO of Magabala Books, the leading Indigenous-owned and controlled publisher of this content on this continent. Genevieve Greaves is a proud Worimi woman and respected artist, curator, educator, field builder, film director, and oral historian. She is recognised as a leader of community engagement and decolonising methodologies in Australia. Genevieve is the co-creator and creative director of storytelling agency Garawa, where she champions projects that place First Nations knowledge and culture at the core. Welcome to you both, and over to you, Lily and Jen.
Thank you so much, Jess. It is an absolute pleasure to be here today. Ginagay, in the language of my people, Gumbaynggirr people, or Ngaji Gurudjan, which is the Yari language of the place that I am calling in from today. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the unceded lands of the Yari and Jugun people, and I pay my deepest respect to their ancestors and elders of this place, past and present. As Jess said, today I'm calling in from Rubibi, which is the Yari place name for Broome, in the north of Western Australia, so as far away as I could possibly be from most of you. If any of you have had the opportunity to visit this place, a place where the Pindan or red dirt meets the bluest of seas, you'd know how incredibly inspiring the country is here. So I have really deep gratitude for this place, not only as the place I now call home, but also as the ancestral country of my children and my partner, and therefore as the nourisher of thousands of generations of my kin. I acknowledge all of the First Nations that each of you are calling in from today too. And I also want to note it is the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. So in recognising this day, I send my love and solidarity across the Indian Ocean to Gaza and the occupied territories and to our Palestinian siblings here on this continent and indeed on this call today. As Jess said in her beautiful introduction, I'm Dr. Lily Brown. It's still a novelty to say that, even after a few years. I'm from the mid-north coast of New South Wales, but I spent my early years on Wadjuk Noongar country, down south here from where I'm sitting now, and then followed on by a decade of incredible time on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people before returning to the homelands of my partner and kids here in Rabibi. I wear many hats, one of those being the CEO of the award-winning Aboriginal community-controlled publishing house Mugaballa Books, and another, as Jess said, as the co-founder and director of Shifting Ground. I'll tell you a little bit more about what we're hoping for from today's webinar shortly, and I'm also going to hand it over to Genevieve to introduce herself and talk more about what it is that we do at Shifting Ground. But first, I want to take the temperature of the Zoom room, and you might have already noticed this is a little bit different to usual webinars because you all came on and you can see one another. And I just want to get a bit more of an idea of where everyone is calling in from and what the collective shape of the shared knowledge that we hold between us might look like as almost 100 people on the call right now. So in a moment, you're going to see a little Menti prompt pop up here in the Zoom. You can join that. And we have a few questions for you. And for those of you that have experienced this before, you just answer the question and it's going to show us a beautiful word cloud. And that first question is, how would you describe your role in the social enterprise sector? So we've got a funder, we have an organisation and company, a storyteller, an enabler, advocate, academic, beginner, an activator, I like that one, a facilitator, a teacher of business, that's beautiful, an operator, an ecosystem, field builder, I'm guessing that's you, Genevieve, evaluator. So what this is showing us when I talk about the shape of our collective knowledge is that there's a lot of diversity on the call today and a lot of different people coming from the sector, which is really what we were hoping for. And we've got 102 people on the call right now. So that's a really incredible collective of people. I can see Challenger in there. Intermediary, varied. That's good. There's a few people I can imagine on this call that wear many hats. And fellow practitioner. We might go to the next question. Which Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander lands are you joining from? And please, if you don't know, just say you don't know. That's absolutely fine. But in saying that you don't know, I also really invite you after the webinar today to jump on Google and find out whose country you're located on. So we've got Wadjuk Noongar, Dharawal, Yagara, Camaragal, Jaja Warang, Kabi Kabi up in Queensland. We've got Bunurong, so from around the bay down there on the south coast. Wurundjeri, Warang, Jagera and Turrbal. And so again, when we think about who we are on this call today and the collectivity of that, I also think about the songlines that have joined the places that each of you are coming from today for thousands of generations. And so I also want us all to understand as we're thinking about what we do in terms of our relationship to this understory, that the places that we're all located on also have held relationships to one another for a very long time. And that's really important, not just when we're talking about who we are as people, but also when we understand place as family and kin. We've got Gadigal in the middle there. Sydney, Gadigal, always represent. Unceded Wangal country. Thank you. Could we go to the next question, please? And this one is really important. One word that describes how you are feeling today. Hopeful, inspired, nervous, busy, excited to learn, exhausted. I feel you. Buoyant. I love that. Flat. I understand. Nervous again. Tired, hopeful, curious, relaxed and soft. These are beautiful words. Depleted. Outraged. Enthusiastic. Safe. Dispirited. So what I'm really kind of seeing here is actually that there's a lot of different levels and energies coming into the room today. And we'll do a check-in on the way out and we'll see how much these words have shifted. Thank you so much, everyone. So we're experiencing a very big moment in the context of our history as humans on this planet. It's also a Friday, and it's also almost December. There's never really been a more important time to check in on one another than right now. So while we're limited today to these words and words in the cloud, I cannot emphasize enough the value of care in lightening the load in the present and very heavy moment for many. And it's within this context that I also thank you all so much for turning up today. We really appreciate your presence and are eternally grateful to the folks at Social Enterprise Australia who so evidently value First Nations wisdom, knowledge and experience as foundational to a healthy social enterprise sector. A sector that understands that accountability to the people and places we hope our work will benefit will in turn also create impact that serves both people and planet today and tomorrow. So over the next little while, I'm excited to introduce you, if you haven't had the privilege of encountering Genevieve Greaves, Dean Sanders, Rona Glynn McDonald and Blaise Quay-Mulliner before now, to an incredible lineup of First Nations change makers who draw on thousands of generations of wisdom every day to animate the work that they do to bring into being a self-determined future for First Nations people and by extension, a better future for all. So each of today's contributors will share learnings around what it is they do and why. And then with any time we have left, we'll hold a brief Q&A before finishing up. So please, as people are presenting, note down any questions that you have, and we'll aim to get to some of those towards the end of the session. For Genevieve and I, in our work at Shifting Ground over the last few years, we've worked with many non-Aboriginal people and organisations to bring this future that I've mentioned into being. And a key principle that guides this future building work for us is that if you can get right what you do with First Nations people, your work with all people will benefit. So in sharing this principle with you, it also becomes the prompt for today's webinar. Responding to this prompt first is, as I've said, my sister and colleague, Warramai woman, Genevieve Greaves. Genevieve, can you talk to who you are, what you do, and why this prompt, if you can get right what you do with First Nations people, you're right with all people will benefit? What does that statement mean for your work? Genevieve, over to you.
Thanks, Lily. And hi, everyone. Excuse my very croaky voice. I'm a little bit sick today, but I'm coming in from Larrakia country. I'm a Warramai woman from the Mid North Coast, not far from where Lily's from. And, you know, been blessed to know her over many years and creating spaces and changes that are really for future generations. So I'm very proud to know her and to work with her. And we founded a company together called Shifting Ground, which is really a collective of a lot of different women and now some men as well, who teach in a lot of different spaces to really shift our society and transform our ways of thinking. I'm also co-founder of Garawa, which is we call it a storytelling agency, but it's a social enterprise, a field building institution, a whole range of different things that really amplifies our mob's voices for change. So that's the kind of work that we do. Yeah, that prompt's a really interesting one, and it's something we talk about a lot in our training. And I've been kind of thinking deeply about this for a number of years. And I think it's useful to think about the context we're in now. So, you know, our society has been shifting for the past sort of 30 years, and there are openings now that weren't there at all. You know, we've moved from a great Australian silence through to a kind of deep desire for connection and engagement with First Nations peoples and cultures. And that's an incredible shift. And you see it everywhere with the development of kind of reconciliation action plans, or the use of First Nations languages, or, you know, First Nations staff being brought into different entities. But there's a few questions we need to ask about that. And the first is, you know, what is the actual shift, and where is the power sharing, you know, and where is the wealth, and where is the opportunity to make real change, and understanding that communities have all the solutions to the problems that they face, but not necessarily always the means to be able to influence the power brokers that they're interfacing with to be able to make those changes. And also noting things like that 0.5% of philanthropy currently goes to First Nations people and initiatives, you know, which is a pretty astounding figure. But it's also important to note that while there has been this big shift in our society, and it kind of comes from a sense of obligation. Really, people know now that they have to do acknowledgement of country, or they have to have these policies. But I don't think there's actually a deep understanding of the value of how we do things, of our ways of doing, being and knowing. And these ways, these cultural principles and protocols don't just have value for us, you know, like Indigenous people across the globe. Our cultures are based in care and reciprocity and connection, and these ways of being actually have value for everyone. And I think that there's a kind of a bit of a shift now, again, because of the climate crisis, and because of the challenges, you know, we face in Australia as a society, that there's kind of a deepening understanding that these sort of Western extractive systems of engagement and of action are actually getting us into the problems that we face right now, and not just with the climate crisis, but with the genocide we see unfolding in Gaza, and also the ongoing genocide in Australia. So I think there's an opportunity here, you know, for people to really deepen their understanding of the actual value of our ways of doing things. And I've had this experience many times in workplaces and institutions where I've been, where my non-Indigenous colleagues are looking at what we're doing and our ways of working and saying, this is actually pretty amazing, the way you're connecting with community, the way you're holding space. And that's what I'd really like to see, is not just a sort of surface accommodation tokenism, you know, a kind of including us in a way, but actually a deeper reckoning with our ways of doing, being and knowing, and incorporating them into a kind of new system that's more about shared work, shared responsibility, and making change that is ethical and just. So yeah, I see the challenges we face at the moment in terms of how we're working together and how we exist in this society. And I also see the opportunities and the hope that can come from doing this work in a grounded way, with actual deep respect and incorporation of values in ways of working. And I think just my final response to that prompt is, you know, the ways that we work are really about humanizing. So humanizing not just us as First Peoples, but humanizing everyone. And in our work in Shifting Ground, the spaces we enter into, the workplaces, the organizations, that's the sort of challenge that everyone feels at the moment. They feel disconnected, and they feel the value of the way that we do this work. Thanks, Lily.
Thank you so much, Jen. And likewise, it's just such a pleasure and privilege to be able to work with you, and to know that what you're talking to as well is actually so realistic when we're thinking about what practice looks like, and not just for First Nations organisations, but for all organisations. So Dean, like Jen, is Worimi and also a Gipar in his community first, but he is also a regulatory and governance expert, a management and leadership expert, and a leading ethicist who advises governments and corporates on integrity systems and ethical processes. So Dean has really particular experience and interest in the intersection between Indigenous knowledge, and sectors such as environment and climate change, which Jen also spoke to in terms of what our knowledge is good for, economics, community development, tourism, leadership, governance, policy, and the space industry. Dean is the lead partner for Deloitte, which is where he's calling in from today, a business focused on matters of governance, leadership, trust, policy, and strategy. And he's unashamedly interested in helping businesses and governments tackle the big and difficult problems, which he says that frankly there are many. Dean, I could go on, but actually what I'm sure everyone wants to hear is from you. So tell us, what learnings are there when we understand that best practice working with First Nations people and communities is also best practice for all?
Maanyung, Lily. Well, good to see you all. I'm going to share a presentation just to make sure I stay on track, because I also know that people like to sometimes, jot some things and share some things. But I do want to come into that conversation, and I'm really pleased that Sister Genevieve there came that way, because it allows me to come in slightly sideways and to think about, firstly, a bit of a challenge there around this language of social enterprise, this way we think of things as being somehow socially directed, as distinct from enterprise directed, solving a problem, a social problem, when in fact that challenge for me is about our systems are, to where Genevieve was going, the right way. We want to invite everybody into that. So of course I've got to begin that properly. And as a cultural man, as somebody who cares deeply about this place and the places that I live, I am, as Lily said, joining you from an office, which is really uncomfortable. I'm normally up on country, but it's rainy and horrible over here in Gadigal, but I am in Gadigal today. So Nadaginya and Gadigal Badagaba is this country that I'm sitting you in. My language, Gatang language for where am I? But I'm not on country, obviously. I'm sitting in a pretty bland corporate space. So I always got to keep my tools of culture close. I always got to hit the sort of things that matter to me. And of course, I need to remind myself and tell people about where I'm from. In my case, Warringal Badagaba, that's freshwater, by the way, country. What am I, a saltwater country? I'm a freshwater man from saltwater country. I grew up in the mountains, up in the cold spaces around Warramai country. So that's freshwater and saltwater mixing. But none in your Marabarago, I want you to acknowledge all the elders of the country that you're on. They have enriched you, they have made you, they have shared with us. They are in your soil, in your blood, in your breath. They are part of everything that exists in life. And of course, and relevant to this conversation, really deeply important to this conversation, is Wanyuwanyaganyila, that this always was Aboriginal land. Wherever you are joining from in this call was Aboriginal land. Wanyuwanyaganyila, but it always will be Aboriginal land. And that's not meant in any way, shape or form as a challenge or as a directive or some sort of claim to territoriality. That really doesn't interest us as cultural people. What it is a recognition of the blood of this country, of the joy and the soul and the strength of this country that's available to everybody, that nurtures everybody in this particular call. It's a gift in this particular conversation. But it does bear on this idea about social enterprise. So just to give you the sort of sense of that, I say that on the idea that, social enterprise and culture, because I think sometimes social enterprise is understood as coming from a particular way of looking at a social outcome. And culture, I think, is something that I've wrestled with for most of my life in its relationship to business and its relationship to Western ways of academic knowledge. I've got a couple of PhDs and I've been in business and government a long time, trying to find a way to navigate those worlds. And I've just given up, frankly, that there isn't a navigable path. And I really want to share that with you, not as a source of frustration, but as simply a source of truth. They are two separate worlds. We meet, but only at the edges. There's a Venn diagram somewhere in there, but it's not the same circles. They're in relationship, like everything about our culture is in relationship with everything else, but it's not the same story. And I want to invite you into thinking about that as part of this conversation of where you all sit right now. This isn't a recipe for how you do social enterprise better. This is a recipe for thinking about how are we affected by the paradigm we sit within, and how do we come into these conversations, because the paradigm matters. When we're talking about social enterprise generally, or talking about things in this sort of space, we often talk about the idea of economics about Indigenous people. Many of you are thinking about, and good people, well-intentioned people, thinking about how do we solve that Indigenous problem? This is often where social enterprise begins. How do we solve that problem of those poor Indigenous people? The whole closing the gap system, and the Assistant Minister mentioned it, is somehow as though there's a problem with our people. Well, I want everybody in this call to know there is no problem with our people. The problem is with you people. The problem isn't the 3%, the problem is the 97%. Because when we frame the challenge, it's a deficit construct. When we're thinking about these are all real problems: housing, education, health, criminal justice. These are problems we experience not because we are Indigenous people, but because you are non-Indigenous people. And so the social enterprise challenge is the other way, in my particular view. So that's one way of thinking about it. The other way is, of course, that we often think about, gee, why don't we come together then and magnify the success for Indigenous people? How do we talk about the economic development of Indigenous people in business? And this is the current language of government. A lot of focus you'll all be aware of is on things like economic self-determination. How do we help businesses grow? How do we help Aboriginal people take opportunity in the marketplace? How do we improve our employment outcomes, our procurement outcomes, our participation outcomes? But those things, and this is going to be a little bit challenging for some, because I've spent most of my life in this space and I completely acknowledge it. I wrestle with the fact that now in my cultural responsibilities as a senior cultural person of my community, that just feels like assimilation, not reconciliation. I've been taught my whole life what success looks like, and success looks like being like non-Indigenous people in this country. That's what success looks like. So every program of support or benefit that I've ever seen, and I do a lot of work obviously with government, with others, just looks like, how can we help those poor Aboriginal people get jobs, get into business, achieve for themselves? Well, look, as an older person, as a senior cultural person, as an elder of my cultural space, that just feels like me being told to give up my culture, being told to give up what matters most to the blood and soil of this country. So the paradigm matters. I don't want anybody to feel bad about it, but I just want you to recognize where we sit in these conversations and where you might be sitting with all the best intentions in the world. Because my view, my strong view, after spending my whole life dedicated to this conversation, is that we need to rewrite the entire framework, that it is about rewriting economics, rewriting politics, rewriting business to recognize that Indigenous knowledge and wisdom is in fact the answer to the problem. We are not the problem, we are the answer to the problem, which reinforces, I think, Sister Genevieve's point there. Because I know that everybody wants connection. I know that you all want a deeper relationship with your place, with your country, with your future, with your family. We are a way of helping you understand that. That is the basis of our culture. That is the basis of the gift. Indigenous business is a gift for everyone. Indigenous business grows differently. It doesn't grow in vertical models of accumulation and wealth. It grows sideways in relationships. It grows into deepening capacities across communities. It doesn't always look successful on paper, but it's successful in community. Because we think about employment in the context of meaningful work, not just in the process of accumulation of wealth. Indigenous knowledge and systems and Indigenous knowledge systems theory around our wisdom systems are the answer to the world's problem. And I say this, by the way, not just from my voice. I want to give you the comfort of this story, not just being Dean's crazy ramblings, but this comes deeply from our cultural understanding. This is something from Uncle David Malajali, who wrote in his book, Yoro Yoro, he wrote this particular paragraph. I want to give it to you as a gift, that we are really sorry for you people. We cry for you because we haven't got meaning and culture in this country. We have a gift we want to give to you, but we keep being blocked from giving you that gift by politics, by media, by politicians. Even the well-intentioned ones like the Assistant Minister who spoke earlier, frankly, I spend a lot of my time kicking those fellas in the shins because they start with the good proposition, but it is coming from a place of deficit framing, as though we are a problem to be solved. We get blocked by media, we get blocked by process of law, and I say that as a lawyer, all we want to do is come out from under all of this and give you this gift of pattern thinking, the gift of our knowledge. We've been trying to give it to this country for 240 years, but have been unable to give that. We haven't been able to be listened to. And I want to frame the conversation about social enterprise this way, because this is the benefit. This is the question that Lily challenged me, that, you know, these are my words, that the opportunity for everybody in this country, for all of you, for every single person in this country, is to participate in our culture, to participate in our relationship with the country, to share the love we have for it, the love we have for you, the love we have for people and family and connection, because that's what deepens us. And I want you all to feel proud of the fact that this culture is still here, still living, still breathing, still practiced, still part of our life. I don't exist outside of my country, outside of my culture. Alone in the world, we have the deepest, oldest, most significant cultural wisdom and knowledge traditions in the world. In a landscape that we understand, that is naturally abundant, that is there for everybody. Indigenous knowledge about how to live successfully in the country and with each other has been encoded over more than 100 millennia into our stories, into our systems. Genevieve spoke about ways of working, knowing, and being. That's the words we use today. We just call that culture. We just call that living. We've had to invent these terms to find ways of translating that into non-Indigenous systems. I'm just no longer interested in that. I want you all to come and sit with me on country. I want you all to just literally come and sit with me, spend time. We will talk together, we will sit together, we'll understand how this country and the nature of our relationships work together. And we have an opportunity to give you that gift, to draw on this Indigenous practice and philosophy to bring radically different approaches to all of today's problems. Aboriginal culture is continuous and thriving. Our cultures are reviving, our languages, our ceremonies are being resurrected and revitalised, and there is knowledge for the benefit of all of you. The gift of Indigenous knowledge is the gift to all of you about how to survive and thrive in this country. Manabu Gapo, I'll stop there for you, Lily, so others can have a chance to say.
Dean, if I was off mute, you would have just heard me like clicking and trying to contain myself. It's a big question right now in our household as well. It's like economic development for what purpose? You know, for what does that mean for the kind of future that we want for our children and for our descendants? For what purpose? And also so grateful that you have gifted to everyone on the call today the words of David Muljalli as well, who for myself, so much of his writings have become part of my philosophy in life. So for those of you that don't know of David Muljalli, the late David Muljalli's work, please Google him. Magabala Books does publish some of his work. So jump on and see if you can find a resource. Dean, thank you so much. That was just incredible. And I feel really humbled actually to be in your presence. And I know here on the West Coast, we don't, unless you've got family, blood connections to people up here in Rabibi, you don't really call people uncle and auntie, but I know that that's different for us East Coast mob. So uncle, thank you so much for joining us on the call today. I feel extremely privileged to have your wisdom shared in this context, in this moment for the development of the understory. I'm going to hand it over now to Rona, but I want to introduce Rona because she is the most incredible woman and she probably wouldn't introduce herself in that way. And just so you all know, that background is not a Zoom background. That is actually where she's sitting at the moment, up on Bundalang country. But Rona is a Kadich woman who grew up in Mparntwe on Aranda country with ties to storytelling, economics and narrative change. Rona works with First Nations organisations to really shape future systems that centre First Nations people, knowledge and solutions. Rona is the founding CEO of Common Ground and co-founder and director of First Nations Futures. She was previously the director of First Nations at YLab, which was a social enterprise that puts young people with diverse lived experience at the centre of designing and developing innovative and impactful solutions to complex social issues. Over her career, Rona has worked in policy at the Central Land Council, the Research Unit for Indigenous Languages at the University of Melbourne, Reconciliation Victoria and the Foundation for Young Australians. And like Dean, that brief introduction does not even begin to scratch the surface. Rona, it's so obvious that in everything you do, from advising businesses and executives of organisations to working with mob on the ground, and even to more recently producing music, you are guided by your old people. What learnings have you got for folks here today?
Feel like I'm learning here, listening to Dean. Such an amazing yarn, and I feel really thankful to have heard what you had to share there, Dean. Ayung Katie Chidam, Perliachi Katie Chidam, Ayung Katananda, Maran Barndwell, Arandarangathora, Nyeri Parankacha, Edmulwi Chadinga, Inanga, Banjalanga Mern. I'm a Kaddish woman from the Central Desert. I grew up on Aranda country, a place where I've been held by ancestors, by elders, by community for most of my life. But I'm Kaddish from a place called Ilinjau, which is 300 kilometres north of Mparntwe, a bit of scrubby plains that for me is the centre of everything, for many people, the middle of nowhere. And I'm very privileged to be here on Bunjalung country as a visitor. I've been here for 6 days, and yes, as Lil said, that background is real. You might see my dog coming here for a sniff, for me to give him a scratch. I've been here chasing the salt and the sun and really entering this green era, this green season in my life. It's too stinking hot in the desert right now to be up there. I, like all First Nations people, come from an amazing family of storytellers. And even more specifically, I come from a family of filmmakers, and from a young age saw the power of cameras and lenses in shining a mirror up to Australia, but also creating space for our communities to tell our stories our own ways as a form of healing and a form of resistance. Our families have been telling stories since the first moments of time, but since 1788, the stories that have been held across this continent, surrounding islands, by non-Indigenous folk have really centered the voices, cultures, aspirations, and knowledges, the amazing knowledges that our families have held since the first sunrise. As a young person, I didn't want to go into the family trade of filmmaking, and I was really interested in other things. I was a bit of a nerd, which was confusing for my family. They thought I'd end up in film or photography, and I loved school. I really loved school because I loved challenging my teachers and getting into big rips in the high school where I would disagree with everything they had to put forward on the table. And one of these moments, which was a really informative moment in my journey, was in year 10. I started to study economics, and I had an amazing economics teacher called Mr. Mummy. And in the school and in the classroom, he taught me about all of the different theories of Western economics. He taught me about demand, supply, productivity, inflation, and growth. And this idea that at the basis and the foundation of the stories that we hold in economics, we speak about how people just want to have more, do more, and be more. And I knew that was bullshit in terms of the way that I was raised. It wasn't the foundation of the knowledges that existed in my home. My earliest memories were sitting around the table at my dad's house, and after school, you'd hear a knock at the door. And an old jilpie would walk in, an old man from country, and some family member that I hadn't met before who'd come from out bush. And Dad would welcome that old fella and sit at the table with him, and they'd share some cups of tea and a yarn or two. And at the end of the yarn, a bit of money would pass over the table. My dad would give that old man a couple $100, and off that old man would go. And 5 minutes later, my dad would pick up the phone and go, "Hey, Erica," it's my auntie, "you got any money, sis? I don't have any." My dad knew that when he had that energy, when he'd received money, when he had a job, he had the obligation to share that amongst family, amongst anyone that needed it, and he would also be held by family around him. That is at the core of what I think is this idea of reciprocity, this idea of keeping balance. When you receive energy, when you receive benefit, you redistribute that benefit, and you know that in a collective care, in collective community, you'll always be held. That's our communities when they're functioning at their best, right? And that's not what economics recognizes, and that's not the foundation of what I was learning in year 10. So as a young, vivacious person, I went off to study it because I wanted to understand more, and I also wanted to understand what opportunities we had to look at how we shift these systems. And I went off to the University of Melbourne and studied economics, and I had many questions going in, and I left with more questions. I don't think I got any of the answers that I wanted. I learned how to calculate inflation. I learned more about utility. I learned how we measure capital, and none of the capital forms of measurement really centered at that time cultural capital or knowledges, which I knew were the core of the way that our communities wanted to build our futures and continue to affirm our aspirations and build our own solutions. So as I left university, I connected with amazing social change community across Wurundjeri country and Boon Wurrung country, and came back to storytelling, recognizing that when we look at any system, whether it's the economic system, the education system, the health system, a business system, an organization, any of these systems were just made up of people. And it's the mindsets and beliefs that inform the behaviors of people in those systems that perpetuate the same outcomes in those systems. And because since the first moments of colonization, non-Indigenous Australia has been built on stories that are founded in colonial mindsets, we can't shift these systems until we shift storytelling that underpins these systems. So I came back to storytelling and founded a not-for-profit called Common Ground, which is about creating space for communities, our communities, to amplify our voices on our own terms and tell stories in ways that center our knowledges, our solutions, our experiences, and truth-telling in everything. And it was in this journey, starting my first not-for-profit, that I began interacting with the world of philanthropy and funding. And it was a really interesting journey that I started and I'm still in today, and something that, as I experienced more and more in the space of funding, began to realize that the inequity that we see across funding is one of the core reasons that our communities don't have the resources to be able to self-determine our own futures. A lot of people focus on government funding. For myself as a young person, I began to look at how do we look at this story of wealth across this continent and the funding ecosystem and the economic narratives that have enabled people to create these huge pockets of wealth that aren't redistributed back to First Nations communities. And I came together with a collective of mob back in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter movement or moment, where we saw this huge influx of capital go into First Nations organizations over the space of a week, when people across this continent realized what was happening across this nation and what was happening across overseas in the US, and the experiences of Black and Brown and Indigenous folk all across this globe. And in that moment, as there was a huge influx of capital, we saw an amazing amount of money come through the door at Common Ground, but after a week, that funding dried up. And it started this spark within me and this collective that I began yarning to about, what is this big story of wealth here? When we look at the story of wealth, where across this continent surrounding islands, all the wealth built here is built off the extraction of country and the dispossession of First Nations people, stolen wages, stolen wealth. How do we start talking about this? How do we start creating space for all of us to come together and yarn about that story? And it's not a new story, right? It's a story that for First Nations people, we've been talking about. My families have talked about it around tables. Generations ago, people were talking about it. But what is the opportunity to use the resources and tools we have now to spark and reignite conversations around that story, and actually hold a mirror up to non-Indigenous folk and talk about, how do we move towards an economy and a future that centers that reciprocity that I talked about? When you receive benefit, when you receive energy, how do you redistribute that? And how do we build a narrative where all Australians are a part of that? Not just the 1% that have assumed a huge amount of wealth, but everyone who is benefiting off living off stolen land actively engages in redistributing that benefit. So that's the journey that began in 2020 for me. And as I said, it's not a new journey. It's many yarns and many people that have held this yarn before us, but started what is now called First Nations Futures, an organisation that has been created to redistribute wealth and power to First Nations organisations and community-led projects, creating intergenerational change, and build more mechanisms for everyone living across this continent and surrounding islands to be part of that redistribution. As Lily said, as Dean said, First Nations knowledge's ways of being, and also Jen said, First Nations knowledge's ways of being have so much benefit, not just for our own communities, but for everyone. And at First Nations Futures, we use really intentional language, such as co-investment, not talking about giving or a hand up or a handout. It's about, how do we collectively come together to invest into First Nations communities so that we can build up our own futures on our own terms, but also so that on our own terms, our knowledges and cultures can also benefit everyone living across this continent and surrounding islands. Reciprocity at the core. And I think when we look at the future and when we build that right relationship across this continent, where we are actively in reciprocity, building communities of collective care, that's a model that can extend beyond everything. I think about at First Nations Futures, the work that we're doing is not just about the redistribution of wealth. It's not just about the wealth back. It's also about, how do we build a future story as a nation where we all hold each other, where, you know, someone can knock on the door and that $200 goes across the table, and then the $200 comes from someone else, and we are actively in relationship, in right relationship with one another, not just within First Nations communities, but across all communities as well. So in terms of the provocation, which I really love today, exploring how might we really center and create those futures where First Nations knowledges and relationships are at the heart of who we are across this continent, who we are as people. I'm really excited by the conversation today and this yarn around economics. I love getting my nerd on, and I think there's so much opportunity to think about future systems that place our mob, country and truth-telling at the center, and social enterprise is such an amazing vehicle for that. And at First Nations Futures, we're developing some models which we'll be continuing to yarn about publicly and start yarning more about publicly in the next few months, looking at how do we extend our work across philanthropy and general Australians to also social enterprise, creating more opportunities for social enterprise to be able to back First Nations organisations and initiatives and really build up our futures on the basis of redistribution and reciprocity.
Thank you, Rona. You're an absolute inspiration. And like I said before you kind of came on, I watch what you're doing in our community in terms of the places that you exist in physically, but also in terms of your family and across the nation. And I know that the legacy that you're going to leave behind after you've gone, which is not for a very long time now, is just going to be so immense, because I think that you kind of change hearts and minds wherever you go, and you're really changing the narrative as well in the philanthropy space, which is so needed. And so I just, have a lot to be thankful for when I listen to you speak, and I'm in your presence and have the gift of your wisdom. It's really great that who we've got following you is Blaze, because something that I learned very early on from Blaze as a mentor, he was a mentor to me in my early 20s. Hi, Blaze. Was a lot around reciprocity and what that means. And Blaze, I'm going to introduce you. I hope you don't feel too awkward about that. But again, I think that my engagement with Blaze in my early years means that in part I would blame him for what I have turned out to be. So it's a real honour to meet him here again in this context. And like all presenters here today, Blaze wears many hats. He's a Palku traditional owner from the Inland Pilbara region of WA. He's an academic, writer, children's author and business owner. And over his professional life, held many positions, including Associate Dean of Teaching and Learning at the University of Western Australia before moving into the private sector in community engagement, cultural heritage and native title. More recently, Blaze has settled into his current career as a business owner and an entrepreneur of many initiatives, including Australian Indigenous Coffee, and he's the chairperson of Emu Nest Investment Group. Blaze has said that his business philosophy is straightforward. Like water, too much wealth is a flood and too little is a drought. First you feed yourself, then you feed your family, then you invest the rest back into the community that supports you and on whose shoulders that you stand on. Blaze, can you tell us a little bit more about what you do and what the prompt guiding today's session means to you? So if you can get what you do right in relation to First Nations people, your work with all people will benefit.
Thanks, Lily. Can you hear me okay? Yep. If it's all right, I might get to the prompt at the end. I was just thinking some morning about sometimes it's hard to work out how to frame a story a bit, but this is a bit left of centre. But I made this guy yesterday. I don't know if you can see this strange creature. Just to give you a thing, he's made out of wool, Spinifex wire and some raffia. I'm here in my mum's studio as we speak. I made him yesterday. I popped over to my mum's house and I was in her studio and I saw some materials there, and I felt compelled to make this dude. So I threw him together, and I was gripped. It gripped me to sit down and do this thing. And for our family, the way we carry out entrepreneurship and social impact is no different from the process of me making that strange-looking man. We do things that compel us, that intrude upon our consciousness and need to be brought into the world, the way a mother brings a child into the world. And that's what businesses are. Entrepreneurs see things people can't see. They feel things other people aren't feeling, and they bring it into being with their hands, with their actions, and they nurture it into being. And so we very much come from that kind of that process where for us and what we do, business is a ceremony. It's a cultural practice, and that is the horse that pulls the cart. So the economics of it and the technical configurations of it, which can be quite difficult sometimes and detailed about how you structure commercial models, that's the cart. But the horse that pulls it is values, is a spiritual alignment, is a ceremonial alignment, is a cultural practice. And sometimes you can get confused about what's the horse and what's the cart, because we have such a strong focus on economics. So I just thought I'd start with that because it, maybe helps tell the story a little bit from how we approach things. We, just a little bit briefly on the origin story, because it tells you why we do the things we do. We're a family of creative visual artists, writers, and academics. We're not business people. And 11 years ago, we got into business because we had a crisis in the family. We had a family member who was very physically ill, and we needed more money to help pay for some emergency surgeries and in the short term. And also, we had a challenge of how our family members with intellectual or physical disabilities or talents that may not be easily taken up by mainstream systems, how they're going to have a quality of life and be able to economically provide for themselves. So we thought, you know what, people seem to do this business stuff. One, maybe that could make some extra money to solve a short-term crisis, but two, that might, if we can get hold of organisations, we could give people jobs and livelihoods that other organisations wouldn't invest in them, but we will invest in them because we think they have value and we think they've got a lot to give. So that led us into pooling our talents and the money that we did have as a small family, as a small little kinship network. We created a family trust, and then we just started building businesses. The first one we did was a kind of a creative writing cooperative. We started co-publishing a number of children's books. Then we started running micro enterprises to teach ourselves about what business was. And if you run a small micro enterprise turning over even just $20,000, you learn everything you need to learn about business, about invoicing and sales and marketing and incorporating companies. And you can, the rest is just scaling up. But if you build something small, you can iterate up, and then you can learn skills. So that's what we did. And the compelling reason for us to get into business was actually life or death. We actually generated enough money to pay for an emergency surgery that if it hadn't happened when it had, that family member actually would have been dead in 6 months. So in terms of, what compels you, it was very compelling. When you love someone and you need money for that kind of purpose, you are highly motivated as an entrepreneur. And then as we solved some of our short-term constraints that we had economically, we wanted to expand the impact and the spread of what we did out for other Aboriginal families, so that we could also, share wealth and share opportunity. In terms of what we managed to then build, we've actually been incredibly successful with what we've done. We've been in business 11 years now. We've bought business, we sold businesses, we started up businesses. We've been through all the cycles of business maturity. We have about 6 businesses now. We employ over 140 people. We'd probably be in the top 10 Aboriginal businesses in WA by annual revenue. We have about 7 other Aboriginal families that are co-investors and co-shareholders across the businesses. We like to partner. We have some non-Aboriginal investors and shareholders as well. We're comfortable with partnerships. We know how to build value in them, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. And we have a mix of shareholding. Some things we own 100%, some 50, some 51, some 10, some 25. So we play around with different types of models, different types of partners. We've done about 40 million in Aboriginal economic impact over the last decade. That's the amount of money our businesses have spent on Aboriginal wages, Aboriginal supplies, and Aboriginal community projects. You add all that up, you get a direct economic impact measure, and that's around 40 million over the last decade. And each of our businesses run slightly different local economic or social impact models, because every business is a different kind of kinship network, and every business has different value to offer community. Therefore, the models that iterate in those businesses and the services that may be of value to community are different. One business is our waste business, for example. We do pro bono bin services. We help communities with cleanups. Another one has some printing capability, and we're doing free printing for Aboriginal funerals, so on and so forth. So, businesses, the value they have for community also depends on their services. So it's nice if you can build impact around the services themselves rather than something that's unrelated. So those are the kind of models that we build. We have been iterating the utilitarian pragmatic aspects of that for a decade now, which can be quite difficult. Often what you have in well-intentioned social enterprises or for-profit entities, you have 2 extremes. One is too much of a focus just on the economics on one end, and the other is too much of a focus on the social value without really deep diving about how you commercialise that in the market. Because capacity building in a social enterprise comes at a cost. So how do you mitigate the cost? How do you iterate your entire business system from even the return on capital required, the shareholders, the alignment, through to the operations, management system specifications, customer value proposition? You have to build the non-monetary values at the core of the whole engine in order to be able to make it commercial. So you have to work twice as hard to do something that's a lot easier if you just focus on making money. So you got to be smarter, you got to be more entrepreneurial, you got to be more creative, you got to have more energy, you got to do a lot more things if you're trying to take capitalism and actually do something that is broader than what the system itself is really designed to reward and incentivize. So that's basically what we've been kind of working through over the last decade is various iterations of how you do that. And there's no easy answers. Every market and every business is different. And also the people that you may partner with or borrow money with or have as co-shareholders or have as leaders in your business, they bring different talents. So, you know, there's this very dynamic moving feast of how you configure that. And that's why I said at the start, what's the horse and what's the cart? Because it can be very complicated, you have to always return to that fundamental cultural practice driver and have some faith that that's going to get you to where you need to go. As long as you can kind of stick to that, you will kind of get where you need to get to. I would also make the, I guess, the point here, you know, businesses, I see it a bit like an iceberg. And the bit of the iceberg that sticks out the top of the water is the economic component of the business. It's obvious, people can see it, it's easily quantifiable. You know, you have revenue, you have costs, you have then your net profit. You know, it's kind of easy to build structures around. But under the water is the social value, the cultural value, the environmental value, the spiritual value that businesses, particularly small businesses, actually create all the time. So you take any business, it has far more non-monetary value than it does have monetary value. All businesses do. I mean, people meet their wives and husbands at work. You know, it's a social network. It's a kinship network. There's so much that happens in the workplace, so much that happens in business, that collection of people from customers, suppliers, to shareholders that come together to create value. Most of the value in that is non-monetary. And then this little bit that sticks out of the water is the monetary bit. And you've got to get that right because otherwise you're insolvent and you don't have a business. But business are actually these amazing engines of transformation. It's just that we're locked into a system where we don't have easy ways to quantify and value in the market the non-monetary values. It's very awkward trying to quantify and value the non-monetary parts of the value prop in a business. So a lot of it's invisible, a lot of it's under the water, but it's there and it happens. And we're getting increasingly sophisticated, I think, in this space globally now around balancing of those types of values. In terms of some philosophy, and in the Q&A, if people got questions or want to have a cup of coffee with me about some of the technical side of configurations of these types of things, that's fine. We can have those. I'm more interested in the philosophy personally, marrying it with the technical stuff, but the philosophy may be a bit different than some things you've been used to be hearing. So when we got into business, one of the things I thought about is first, this is going to sound super philosophical, but the first thing I thought, what's the purpose of a human being? So what in an Aboriginal worldview, what's your reason for being? And I thought about it and I thought, well, really your reason for being is to receive, create and distribute value through kinship networks, through practices of reciprocity in a way that sustains people and country. Now, in our philosophy, the moment you're born, you're breathing oxygen. Oxygen exists because we would say plants have their own law, and in the law of the plants, they produce oxygen. So the moment you are born, you are already a recipient of the reciprocity of the world. You can't exist, you can't breathe, you can't move, you can't even, exist as a human being without being the recipient of reciprocity from the environment that you actually co-inhabit. So we're always receiving reciprocity from the world, always. So the question then really becomes, I'm receiving all this reciprocity. How then do I then pass that reciprocity on back in through relational networks? How do I create more value to push reciprocity back and through the system? And then how do I distribute it? So really it's about a value, reciprocity is a value distribution allocation mechanism. And then there's cultural frameworks about how that's done. But that's really your role as a human being, is you're the recipient of value. Then how do you create value and push that through relational networks? But value that sustains things. So it's not just any value. It's value that is sustainable in the long term for the environment and the world we live in and the people that co-inhabit it. And so that becomes the design principles of what a human being's supposed to do. So then you kind of go, well, what's a business? You say, well, a business is just a kinship network. It's not more complicated than that. It's a collection of human beings that come together to create value. That's all a business is. And a business kinship network is you can constrain it a bit. You could say it's shareholders and its employees and its customers and its suppliers and the communities where you operate. So you can constrain that kinship network a little bit, how you describe it. And you can constrain it again, where you can say it's a bit of an unusual kinship system because it has to make a minimum amount of economic value to distribute, or it can't exist because otherwise you're insolvent. So those are probably the two constraints you would put on how you would delineate a business as a kinship system, as a relational system is another way to put it. And then outside of those limitations, you are as free as you can imagine to create and iterate stuff, and people often don't take up that level of creativity with business. They kind of just copy what's out there, but actually it is a very blank canvas to play with. So that's what we see business is. It's a cultural practice. It's a ceremonial practice. It's a kinship network composed of those employees, shareholders, customers, communities, suppliers. We need to bring those relationships together to create and distribute value according to practices of reciprocity and in a way that promotes, a sustainable world for everyone. To me, that's the that's the philosophical background of what a business is, what we're describing it. So if we describe a business and economic systems in the language of Aboriginal philosophy, that's how at least I would, try and describe actually what it is. That then brought me to two kind of questions downstream from that, from a design and engineering perspective of how you build something, which is when you're building a business, the first question then becomes, what are the practice of value creation and reciprocity that will apply to this entity? Because that dictates how you cohere that kinship network. It dictates who are co-investors, who are shareholders, what communities you operate in, how you build the value proposition up. So, and because they'll all be different, they'll have different iterations of those because they have different people involved. Different people involved gives you a different kinship network, which means you iterate the structure slightly differently. So that's the first design question that came out of the philosophy and that impacts how our family build things. The second downstream part of that is how do you create then a healthy kinship network? So if a kinship network is a relationship network, what makes one healthy and what makes one sick? And so I looked at some of our, traditional practices around reciprocity and trying to extract some kind of underlying principles from that. And I kind of came up with these four things we used to guide the family, which was autonomy, accountability, belonging, and trust. I won't go through all of those because we'll run out of time. The first two, autonomy and accountability, speak to the individual. And the second two, belonging and trust, speak to the network. They speak to the group. And I'll touch on those. So belonging, here's a real easy one. You're all part of an organisation somewhere. Is there a high sense of belonging to the organisation you work at or a low sense of belonging? And you can ask your co-workers and people know straight away. You either feel a sense of belonging to that organisation or you don't. Low belonging equals low productivity because it's a sign of sickness in a kinship network. Now, you can try and counteract that by having economic incentives. So I know you hate your job, but I'll pay you twice as much. Keep coming. But then you start making problems for yourself when you try to fix. Some people are very motivated by economic incentives. Most people aren't, or it's a mix or it's a blend. So ideally, you want high belonging. High belonging are high productivity organisations. And so if you've got a kinship network and there's a high sense of belonging, it's a good metric of whether it's travelling well in a relationship. And you can apply this stuff to a marriage, to your relationship with your kids. These are relational principles, right? So belonging is the first one. Every decision we make in our businesses, is this going to increase or decrease belonging? Now, that doesn't mean you won't make decisions that decrease belonging, because sometimes there's a short-term decrease to get a net positive on a longer-term viewpoint. But be aware of what you're doing, because belonging is not an infinite pool that you can draw down from, right? If you empty that pool, you have catastrophic problems occur in your organisation. So when we make decisions, we're very clear, are we increasing or reducing belonging in the organisation through this strategy, through these actions? Is customer belonging going to go down? Is supplier belonging? Is employee belonging? Is the belonging of our other shareholders who feel they're part of this story and part of this business? Are we diminishing that? Because we will pay a price for that. And so you have to be very strategic in how you apply that as decisions. The second one, which is a bit more complicated, is trust. And I'm going to run out of time in a sec, so I'll finish on this one. When we say trust, in business, trust normally means if my self-interest and your self-interest are aligned, I trust you to act in your own interest and be predictable, to do what you said you were going to do, because it's in your own interest to do so. So you really talk about aligned self-interest in business. That's actually what fuels 90% of the kind of Kabbalistic philosophy. In the Aboriginal sense, trust means if I've got a kinship network, each member of that kinship network has to believe that the other members would sacrifice some of their self-interest so that they and their family can be looked after. So I don't even need to show up and have a fight with people or argue over resources, because even if I'm not there, I know the group will sacrifice some of their self-interest to make sure I have enough. Now, if you can answer that question in the positive, you've got an incredibly strong kinship network in that organisation. The relational network is strong. If you can't answer that, it means people come into the network to fight for resources that they do not believe others are going to give them. And you have a cascading dysfunctional effect that you can see in many community organisations sometimes, where you've got scarcity issues, you get poverty mindsets, you don't have growth mindsets, and you have a lot of derivative problems. Now, so we are always trying to make sure that that trust question of people do believe that we would make less money to look after them. You get additional problems though in our community, where what do you do then when when people in the network don't have anything to give? Some members of our community's value is locked up socially, culturally, economically, and other things, and they do not have any value to give back to the kinship network. So part of what you do as a leader and as designing and engineering a healthy business is you go, for the parts of our organisations where people don't have something to give up, we have to build their capacity to have surplus value. Once they have surplus economic value, it will unlock their social value, it'll unlock their cultural value, it will unlock the spiritual resources they have to allocate back into the kinship network. So it's not always about sacrificing economic. They could be, a lot of Aboriginal businesses will pay a spiritual, cultural elder to come and hang out with the business. So they bring in spiritual value. You don't necessarily bring economic value, but they can bring that spiritual value because you unlock them economically by providing them an income stream, which then unlocks the spiritual value they have to be able to put into the kinship network and have something to give up. I'll go on for otherwise, so I'll stop because I'm going to finish up. Just quick note on the prompt. I think the prompt is the wrong question. If you come to the table asking, how is this going to benefit from me? You're asking, how do we have aligned self-interest? So that's an aligned self-interest question. I'm more interested in saying, look, if you have curiosity, then you're welcome. If something compels you, you're welcome. If something's gripping you to come and have an engagement and have some fun and learn things and listen and also have things to give, then you're welcome. If it's convince me on a cost-benefit analysis of what benefit it is from me to engage, I'm not as interested in that, because that's a fragile relationship. And I think most of our communities, particularly after the referendum, we're actually more interested in deeper relationships. So I'll finish there.
Blaise, thank you. As you were speaking towards the end, someone wrote to me and said, this guy needs to write a book. He has such an amazing philosophical brain. And I could also see Rona geeking out big time. So I think you two need to connect and talk a little bit more. I'm feeling really overwhelmed and again, really humbled by all of the knowledge that everyone shared. We have a little bit of time. We have about 10 minutes before Dean has to jump off. And I want to just have a little bit of a Q&A to get people speaking to one another, so we can hold some space collectively for everyone that's come onto the call to share today. My brain is overflowing. We have some really great questions in the chat. I'm going to start with one that may seem simple at first, but actually I think is really important in this moment, again, when we've got all of these people that have joined to hear you all speak today. And I want to start with you, Dean. We've got from Kylie, for those of us who want to listen, want to understand more, where is the best place to start? And I think this speaks a little bit, Blaze, to what you talked of in terms of curiosity. But Dean, have you got any ideas for people on the call? Where's the best place to start for those that want to do more in this space?
Thanks, Lily, and thank you for that question. There's definitely a place to start, but I have to start by giving a shout out there to Minna, who I've really enjoyed watching her put that young fella in that car seat and see those feet waving about. It was a bit of a distraction, Blaze, I've got to tell you, brother, to your yarn, but I enjoyed it. It's for those of you who weren't watching, that was like a little sideshow of this particular yarn. So shout out there, Minna. Look, as I was hinting to the crowd, I am nothing without my country. My country defines me. It is who I am. It's the blood, it's the DNA, it's everything that informs me, including on my science, including on my law, LAW and LORE. I lead an economics practice in Deloitte. You know, we are experts in this field. All of that only makes sense in the context of law. The absolute place to start is on country. The absolute place to start is to sit in that place. Come and sit with me. Come and sit with others. And we will just being in that process, country is our teacher. All that stuff that Blaze shared with you is beautiful knowledge about coming from our relationships. Our relationships are with country. They are of country. They are for country. Our kinship systems exist in those processes. Country is our teacher. We've learnt that. We've learnt the language of that. We've learned how those things work because country is our teacher. And I know it's going to sound like a flippant answer, but it's the deepest possible answer I can give you is that you sit in country and it is the teacher. Economics makes sense. Economic systems and complexity theory, that's one of my PhDs, complexity theory and law comes from country. It's not rocket science, so I thought it was. I thought I was being a clever dick learning all that sort of stuff in the academic sense until I sit with my elders back then when I was young and they said, that's just Aboriginal knowledge, boy. Of course it is. Wish they'd told me that before I spent 6 years doing it. That would have been slightly helpful to understand that this is stuff that comes from country, comes from our relationships to these places. So economics comes from country. Leadership comes from country. Systems and the livingness of systems. Uncle David Mojali's point in that book, Yoro Yoro, Everything Standing Up Alive, is a story of country. So that's an easy answer, because when you're sitting on country with me, we can then have a deep and proper conversation about how all this stuff matters. If you can't be with us, sit there by yourself and listen for the language of economics in the systems around you. Look what those ants are doing. Look what that tree is doing. Look what those plants are doing. Look at what that sun is doing and how those systems are in relationship with each other and how that will get growth in all things. That's what our economics is about, is how everything grows, how everything stands up alive when you pay attention to the relationships in the system as opposed to only the outputs.
Thank you so much, Dean. Does anyone else, Verona, do you have a comment on that? What's something, just briefly, that you would like to share in terms of, for people on this call, getting started?
my answer would have been the same as Dean's there.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, like when the question was asked, that was where I first went to, is just like being present in this space, right? Where I am now, which is not my country. I'm a visitor here, but as a visitor here, to sit and to listen and to be present in this space is a space that I learned a lot. And I think that starting from place and starting from that space is exactly how I would approach that as well. And constantly returning to that as well, I think is such a powerful thing. There are so many opportunities and tools for non-Indigenous folk to engage with our communities now, whether that's online or in person. But those relationships are only sustained when we take time to spiral in and spiral out, and to sit still in country and to reflect, but also to recognize that we never have the answers, and the answers come from country, and the answers are, you know, often shifting as well. And I think that returning to country is something that I'm young, right? I'm still young, I'm 28, but I've been growled so many times by my elders and elders who aren't my elders as well, that I gotta, you know, literally sit down. This year my aspiration was to sit down, and I'm here and I'm constantly learning from that. And I think that everyone can too, and that's such a powerful thing that we all have for us here. It's such a gift to be able to sit in country and to be able to learn from the places that we're in and grow in those connections to the places where we go and where we sit.
Thank you, Rona. And I keep thinking about what Blaise said in terms of that baby whose first breath is that oxygen that was gifted to them, you know, by trees, and looking at you there sitting with that beautiful greenscape behind you, knowing that that's exactly what you're doing now is really lovely to me. Jen, I'm going to ask you, and this is based on a comment from one of the audience members who asked if panelists can speak to the silence of the sector, and speaking up and speaking out and taking action is actually part of the social enterprise work. You know, like what role do social enterprises have in that kind of advocacy space?
Well, in answering that, I'm really influenced by your research and your work, Lily, where you really identify where the silences come from in terms of non-Indigenous people and the fear that they have in speaking up, the fear of saying the wrong thing, the fear of being racist unintentionally. Like there is so much fear and worry and concern that people have, non-Indigenous people, in actually speaking up or taking action, and that's a big block for us to making effective change in this society, because it really has to be collaborative work, you know, that we do. We need people working alongside us. We need people shifting, you know, the systems we're in, helping us to fight the battles, supporting community aspirations. So yeah, we, in the training that we do, we always encourage people to really, you know, take action, and that action shouldn't be rushing out thinking you're knowing what the best thing to do is, or being a white savior or any of those things, but taking really deep, considered action in partnership with First Nations people and communities. So you are actually making yourself an effective tool for change. But really, you know, in that sort of question about what are the first steps, and I've just loved listening to the wisdom of all the panelists. And I just add to that, you know, there's so much, and I think Rona already said this, but there's so much that you can read and engage with, like even understanding the story of the country you're on is such an important first step. And then working out how you can be actually an effective ally or accomplice, or whatever the word is that you use. But the way I was taught by my elders is that this is collaborative work. This is something we can't do alone. We have to do it together. And one of those elders comes from an organisation called the Koori Heritage Trust in Melbourne that he established, Uncle Jim Berg, a Gimdich Murray elder. And the motto of that organisation is Nokandana Marakoki, give me your hand, my friend, you know, and that was the ethos that he taught me and many other people to hold in how we do this work.
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm really conscious of time, but Blaise, I'm going to ask you, do you have anything else to add before we start to wrap up?
I would probably just follow on from the question that you just had, really, which is to say we have this kind of unusual thing in Australia where we have this absolutely vibrant Aboriginal entrepreneurship space that's growing like a weed year on year. And then we have this social enterprise space, and it's like two railroad tracks running side by side, and there's no crossing points. And it's quite bizarre, and it's reflected in the institution. So my answer would be not an answer at an individual practitioner level. It would be that there is a deficit in the institutional network systems between the Aboriginal Business Chambers, Supply Nation, the social traders, the kind of social enterprise type bodies that are trying to represent groups of those businesses, and the interface is weak. And it's true internally as well. Internally in the Aboriginal space, our relationship between the institutions that are promoting us is weak. They don't collaborate well. And I think that's also true in the social enterprise to some extent as well. So we've got those problems already internally, and then they're magnified when we're trying to work out about how those bridges cross. So there's definitely some rich intellectual relational work to be done in entity to entity, organisation to organisation, in terms of these rep kind of bodies. And sometimes there's politics and people's personal things involved in this, you know, so I just need to get out the way, because it's like we're too small a sector to be arguing with each other. It's a waste of everyone's time. So we need to build those, I think, bridges to, because it's hard if you're an individual practitioner doing something. You know, you are under so much pressure out there, and to deliver your social mission and to also be profitable. And you'll have all sorts of demands on you as well from your personal circumstances and family. And you may be the only person in a network that has capacity, so people are calling on you. You don't have necessarily the surplus time and capacity to pick up some of this stuff. The institutions need to pick that up. Our rep bodies need to pick that up. And then we need to support those bodies to do that work where and where we can. And that's the framework that the individual practitioner can sit in. So that would be my comment, that we need to find a better way to build the knitting of the sector.
Thank you so much,
Hey,
Blaise.
Lily-
And that's probably the most perfect. Oh, Dean?
Can I jump in just to say
Yeah.
goodbye and thank you? But just to follow up, because I can see that Celia has asked a question there about texts and resources, and there are, of course, books, and we can reflect on economic text. There's a growing body of economic science and business technologies, and in relationship to our ways of thinking. But those references can be had, and you're all invited to read them. But the conversations begin with people. Our kinship systems aren't written systems; they are systems of relationship. Find those relationships, find those connections, call us for a yarn. Every one of us feels those responsibilities deeply. I'm not trying to preempt Cheryl's answer, as I can see she appears to be typing one, but nonetheless, the idea is nonetheless one of relationships and conversation. And unfortunately, with that, I do have to say, Gapu, in our my language, that means speak soon. And Manabu, thank you for the time to come together. I know you might be continuing to talk, but I have to jump off, unfortunately.
Yada, yada. Thank you so much, Dean. We really appreciate your time. So off the back of Blaise and Dean, I actually want to plug Social Enterprise Australia. And I don't do this because I feel compelled to, because they've hosted us today. But I really want to emphasize that for the understory, we are the first webinar to kick that off. And that's not a coincidence. That's because Social Enterprise Australia, as the peak body now that exists for social enterprises, values so fundamentally and deeply what we as First Nations people have to offer this space. And so I really invite all of you to sit with that and to take seriously what we've shared today, and to see in Social Enterprise Australia as that peak body, the fact that they value us and understand the importance of us for the work that you do. And that's what we hope in inviting you to participate in this webinar. You've kind of realised that as well. We're going to drop a link into the Zoom, another Menti, because I just want a word from each of you that reflects how you are feeling on your way out of here. And then I'm going to handball it back to SEA so they can wrap up. I want to thank the contributors today. I knew that I was going to learn something. I didn't realise I was going to learn so much and so much that was so profound. So thank you so much, Blaise, Rhoda, Jen and Dean, now he's gone. I really, really, again, feel humbled by everything that you've brought today. And I know that I'm going to be starting the weekend. When I started, I was pretty tired myself, but I think someone in the beginning said they felt buoyant, and that's how I'm leaving this webinar. So thanks, Jess and team. Thank you to all of the contributors, and thank you to each of you for spending your lunch break with us today. And I can see some of these words, and I get the feeling that you all feel the same way. So Jess, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thanks, Lily. I'm so grateful for this conversation today. I was recently in a workshop facilitated by Lily, and she asked the room, "Who are you?" And that question, at least for me, was so hard to answer. Says so much about the work to be done. Thank you so much, Lily and Jen, and to the team behind the scenes at Shifting Ground, Maya Gaddis and Andrea Di Stefano. Thank you, Rona, Dean, and Blaise, for sharing your insights, experiences, and time today, for the invitation to sit with you, and for your invitation to learn and unlearn from you and to shift systems with you. Thank you, Andrew Lee, for your support for today's event and for our field. And thank you, everyone online here today. We hope this first Social Enterprise Development Initiative learning event was worth the wait. It's really important to us that this work continues to be shaped by you. So before you jump off, please take a minute to complete the survey popping up on your screen now. Finally, I want to move a poll off my screen and over my notes. Acknowledge and thank the teams at Social Enterprise Australia and the Department of Social Services who are supporting the development of understory and learning communities. Shout out to Christina Chun, Cara Porter, Liz Armitage, Athanasia Price and Cheryl Reddy from Social Enterprise Australia, and to Judy Singler and Alexia Tribe from the Department of Social Services. Keep an eye out for the Social Enterprise Development Initiative calendar of free, connective and collaborative open learning events in 2025. Thank you so much all.